The lid of the casket was carved from dark walnut, the velvet within, a deep imperial red, barely cradled what remained of Spain's last Habsburg king. His mouth did not close. No matter how gently the attendants tried to guide the jaw, it remained slack, stretched, as if frozen mid-word. But Charles II had no words, not in life, and certainly not in death. A court physician, summoned more to observe than to heal, leaned close and whispered under his breath. He could not speak. He could not father a child. He could hardly breathe. And yet, he wore a crown. Outside, the bells of El Escorial tolled solemnly, echoing through the cold corridors of power. Priests prepared their last rites, though the rituals felt oddly hollow. This was not a king felled by sword or sickness. He had been eroded, quietly, from within. For 6 centuries, the House of Habsburg ruled from Spain to Austria, touching nearly every corner of Europe. Their empire was stitched together not by war, but by weddings. Cousins married cousins. Uncles wed nieces. Generation after generation, they preserved their bloodlines with almost religious fervor. But blood, when forced into a circle, begins to rot. The Habsburgs were obsessed with purity. They feared outsiders. They feared contamination. And so, in their pursuit of eternal dominance, they built a dynasty so tightly wound that it began to choke itself. This is not just a story of kings and queens. It is the story of how bone remembers, of how the very structure of a jaw became a curse, etched into the flesh of children not yet born. And this is the story of an empire, crushed not by enemy armies, not by betrayal or plague, but by the weight of its own genetic mirror. They were not born to rule a country. They were born to rule a continent. For over 6 centuries, the House of Habsburg extended its influence across Europe like the branches of an ancient tree. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Burgundy, parts of Italy, even the Holy Roman Empire. From the Alps to the Atlantic, the Habsburg crest cast long shadows over the courts of Europe. They were emperors, archdukes, and kings, and at their height, they were the most powerful dynasty on earth. But it was not the battlefield that built their empire. It was the marriage bed. A saying was born from the lips of diplomats who watched Austria grow fat with inheritance. Bella gerant Ali. To Felix Austria nube, they said. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was a policy as deliberate as any military campaign, a strategy sharpened not by sword, but by blood. It was under Maximilian I, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1508, that this strategy crystallized into law, a shrewd and calculating ruler. Maximilian looked not to conquer by force, but to unite by lineage. He married Mary of Burgundy, linking his line to the wealth of the Low Countries. His son married into the Spanish throne. His grandchildren married each other. What began as political genius began to mutate into something else. By the time Maximilian died, the Habsburg dominion spanned across Europe like veins on a map. But within those veins, something was stirring, a flaw, a knot in the fabric of inheritance. The same names repeated in family trees. The same faces appeared in portraits. The same blood turned in circles. They did not yet see it. They only saw the reach of their power. From the Vatican to Vienna, from Madrid to Milan, the name Habsburg meant command. Their castles rose higher. Their coats of arms grew more elaborate. But as the maps were painted and repainted with their crest. No one dared look too closely at the children those marriages produced. Portraits of royal heirs showed smooth skin, strong posture, and wide brows. But the painters knew which angles to avoid. They knew not to dwell on the mouth. Because even then, even as the empire stretched its arms across a continent, the signs were beginning to show. Not in law, not in policy, but in the flesh. They called it the Habsburg jaw, prognathism, a forward-thrusting lower jaw that made speech difficult, chewing harder, and in severe cases, breathing a burden. At first, it was subtle, a slight asymmetry in a young prince's smile, a chin too prominent in a daughter's wedding portrait. But over time, it became unmistakable. The lower face lengthened, the teeth no longer met, and the royal painters, bound by duty and fear, learned how to tilt heads, shadow lips, and flatter deformities with clever brushwork. Yet no painting could hide what the court whispered. The children were not right. As the generations passed, the lines between cousin and spouse, between aunt and bride, blurred. The family trees no longer branched. They circled. And with every union meant to preserve power, a deeper weakness took root. Mental fog, epilepsy, infertility, soft bones, and swollen joints. The Habsburgs were growing ill from within, even as their titles multiplied. But still, the marriages continued, because in their eyes, every alliance outside the bloodline meant vulnerability. Every marriage to a foreign family threatened the delicate balance of power they had so carefully constructed. They did not see the danger in what they kept. They only feared what might come in. The empire, from the outside, gleamed with gold. The halls of El Escorial, the palaces of Vienna, the tapestries of Bruges, all testified to grandeur. But beneath the marble, the foundations were cracking. Not from rebellion, not from invasion, but from the invisible code passed silently between parent and child. Maximilian's dream of a unified Europe, stitched together by sacred bloodlines, was unfolding. But he had not accounted for the nature of blood. That it remembers, that it resists being contained, that when forced to repeat itself, it turns inward and decays. The tragedy of the Habsburgs did not come from ambition. It came from success, from a vision so complete that it became blind, from a dynasty that married itself into a corner, until the only heirs it could produce were reflections of reflections, voices trapped in mouths that could no longer close. Philip IV of Spain stood as a king burdened not only by empire, but by blood. He ruled over vast territories, from the Americas to the Mediterranean. Yet his greatest political duty was not military conquest or diplomatic treaty. It was marriage. In 1649, he married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was just 14. He was 44. It was not unusual for monarchs of his time to marry young. It was also not unheard of to marry within the family. But this union was different. Mariana was not a distant cousin. She was the daughter of Philip's own sister. Their genetic link was as tight as a double knot. To the advisors at court, it was a logical continuation of tradition. To the royal bloodline, it was a step toward irreversible collapse. Their marriage was plagued with tragedy. Out of 5 children, only 1 survived infancy. That child was Charles. Even before he was born, whispers traveled the corridors of the Alcazar. Midwives kept silent. Physicians looked away. Something was wrong. When Charles was delivered, the room fell quiet. His head was large, his tongue swollen. His limbs were fragile. He could not nurse. He could not hold his own gaze, but he had royal blood. That was enough. He was baptized with the pomp of kings. Bells rang, trumpets flared, and the archbishop declared him a gift from God. In private, the nurses wept. They knew what the doctors would never write. Charles II had inherited the legacy of centuries, but not the kind carved on coins or etched in stone. He had inherited the weight of bodies married too close, of bones folded upon themselves, of jaws grown long and minds grown slow. As Charles grew, the portraits began. Oil on canvas, rich velvet robes, jewels clasped to frail fingers. But the artists had learned by now. The light must strike from the left. The jaw must be painted in shadow. The lips must be softened, never parted, never shown. It was not vanity. It was survival. To paint the truth was to risk shame. To shame the king was treason. As the portraits multiplied, so did the lies. Each brushstroke became an act of concealment. The truth of the Habsburg face could not be allowed to reach the people. Not the deep-set eyes that could not focus, nor the slack mouth that could barely form words. Most of all, not the chin, that unmistakable jut of bone, inherited again and again, until it no longer resembled a human feature but a grotesque emblem of dynasty. Court physicians were instructed to write cautiously. Their reports used delicate language. The prince was delicate, slow to develop, spiritually gifted. But behind closed doors, the language changed. They spoke of seizures, of an inability to chew solid food, of a child who could not learn to walk without falling, and who repeated phrases he did not understand. Mariana clung to religion. She filled the palace with priests and prayers, desperate to summon a miracle where medicine had failed. Each night, she sat by her son's bed, whispering psalms while servants changed his soiled linens. The king said little. Philip IV had once commissioned more paintings than any ruler in Europe. Now, he avoided looking at his son. One advisor dared to question the silence. He was reassigned to the colonies within the month. Outside the palace, Spain was weakening. Wars drained the treasury. The plague emptied the streets. And yet, all eyes turned inward, toward the child who could barely hold a spoon. He was the heir, he was the future, and he was failing. In public processions, Charles was placed in elaborate carriages, propped upright with cushions and wires. Onlookers cheered, but few saw his eyes. Vacant, absent, the look of a boy whose body had been born to rule, but whose mind never arrived. And yet, no one dared name the truth. The court continued its rituals. Marriages were arranged, alliances secured. And all the while, the blood turned further inward, folding upon itself like a curse carved into the flesh. Before Charles, there was Joanna. Joanna of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, had once been destined to rule a united Spain. She was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply devout. But her mind did not move like others. From her early 20s, she heard voices no one else could hear. She spoke to shadows. She wept through the night for reasons no priest could explain. And when her husband died, she refused to let go. They said she slept beside his coffin, that she opened it at night to kiss his face, that she traveled across Spain with his body, convinced he would return. The court called her mad, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, but they did not ask why. Her father locked her in a convent. Her son left her there. 46 years passed. She died behind walls that knew her voice better than any living soul. The official records claimed it was for her safety. The truth was less noble. Her presence embarrassed the crown. Her instability was an open wound in a dynasty obsessed with control. No one dared name it then. But Joanna's mind had not broken on its own. Her grandmother had shown signs of the same fraying. Her niece would later exhibit fits of trembling and sudden fury. It was not possession. It was not grief. It was blood. By the time Charles was born, Joanna was a forgotten name. Her story buried beneath relics and prayers. But her legacy lived on in the silence, in the way the court averted its eyes from symptoms that could not be cured by incense, in the way advisors praised the boy's piety instead of his mind, in the way priests were summoned instead of physicians. The omens were there, generation after generation. But the closer they came, the more fiercely the court denied them. To acknowledge the curse would be to unravel the myth of divine right. So they tightened their robes, they lit more candles, and they turned their backs on the truth. Inside the palace, denial became ritual. Every new symptom was shrouded in sanctity. A tremor was a test of faith. A vacant stare, a sign of spiritual depth. When Charles began to suffer frequent digestive failures, the physicians attributed it to melancholy humors. When he lost the ability to control his bladder, they blamed the alignment of the stars. But in the chambers of those who served him, the truth could not be avoided. Servants watched as the boy fumbled with utensils, his fingers trembling over bowls of thin soup. Pages were instructed to keep his garments dry and perfumed. Tutors sat before him, repeating the simplest of lessons, day after day, while he blinked and smiled, unable to repeat a word. They said he was pious, that he loved to hear the scriptures read aloud. But what he loved, truly, was rhythm, the repetition of sound, not its meaning. Those who knew whispered behind closed doors. They passed notes in corridors, eyes cast low, but no one spoke aloud. To question the health of the air was to question God's will. To name the deformity was to name the dynasty's shame. And yet, the signs kept multiplying. Letters from ambassadors grew tense. Foreign courts sent emissaries to observe the boy, their words carefully chosen, but their meaning clear. France inquired twice whether the prince had yet spoken. Austria requested no portraits. England declined the suggestion of betrothal. But within the Spanish court, the answer remained the same: silence. Even among the physicians, a different kind of fear took root. Not fear of the illness, but of exposure. Their task was no longer to cure, but to conceal. They wrote reports that balanced delicately between absurd optimism and theological poetry. One claimed that the prince's quiet demeanor reflects the serenity of angels. Another suggested his slow growth allowed him to remain untainted by the vanities of adulthood. They all knew better, and above them, Mariana prayed. She walked barefoot through stone corridors, rosary clutched tight in shaking hands, begging the Virgin for strength. She refused to consider that the sin might not be hers, but the crowns, that her child's suffering was not punishment, but pattern. Charles II did not walk until he was 4. Even then, it was more of a shuffle than a stride, supported by attendants who braced his arms as if he were made of porcelain. He did not speak in full sentences until he was 7, and the words came slurred, stretched, as if pulled from a mouth that had never quite learned how to form them. When he laughed, it was sudden and hollow. When he cried, it came without tears. The court praised his gentleness. They said he was a quiet soul, contemplative, blessed with humility. But behind closed doors, his tutors despaired. He could not memorize prayers. He confused faces. He stared at birds through the window as if trying to understand how they remained in the air. A simple toy could captivate him for hours, but a conversation, even a brief one, left him lost. His body fared no better. He suffered from intestinal disorders so severe that some days he could not eat. His jaws, misaligned from birth, made chewing a labor. His tongue protruded slightly, heavy and unwieldy, affecting both his speech and his breathing. He drooled in his sleep. He wheezed when anxious. He fainted without warning. By adolescence, it was clear that Charles could not rule. But the court had no other choice. Every attempt to produce another heir had failed. The family tree no longer branched. It circled itself like a crown of thorns. And so Charles was groomed not as a sovereign, but as a symbol. He sat on a throne he could not command. He signed decrees he could not read. He received foreign ambassadors with a vacant smile and hands that trembled over the scepter. Physicians continued their charade. In private memos now locked in archives, they described his condition with chilling honesty. One wrote that the king possesses the constitution of a corpse and the comprehension of a child. Another noted reproductive faculties non-existent, cognitive delays severe, probable hereditary degeneration. But these words never reached the public. In public, Charles was celebrated. Holy processions were arranged, candles lit in his name. He was paraded through streets in golden carriages, hailed as the chosen defender of Catholicism. Religious leaders proclaimed his suffering to be a sign of divine selection. The people bowed, the choir sang, and the king, barely able to remain upright, nodded without understanding why. Inside the palace walls, a different truth unfolded. Charles lived like a prisoner of silk and velvet. Every morning, his attendants dressed him layer by layer, fastening buttons he could not reach, smoothing lace he could not feel. They guided his hands to the rosary. They held the mirror steady as he stared into it, unsure of what stared back. His days passed in repetition. Mass, meals he barely touched, long silences, the reading of state papers he could not interpret. When guests were present, a servant would whisper the appropriate responses into his ear. When alone, he wandered the halls, sometimes muttering, sometimes smiling at statues. But even in solitude, he was not safe. In his final years, Charles began to suffer from seizures. They came at night, sudden and violent. His body, so frail, would contort as if gripped by invisible hands. Afterward, he would weep like a child. He did not remember what had happened. He only knew he had woken on the floor, surrounded by shattered icons. Rumors swirled. Some said he was possessed. Others claimed he had been cursed. Whispers of witchcraft reached the ears of the Queen Mother. In desperation, she summoned priests to perform exorcisms. Holy water was sprinkled, Latin prayers chanted for hours. One friar insisted that a demon was lodged in the king's blood, that it had entered through sin, though he dared not name whose. The ritual lasted through the night. Candles burned low. The king lay on a stone floor, soaked in oil and sweat, eyes wide open, mouth ajar. He did not resist. He did not speak. When the rites ended, he remained still. The priest placed a crucifix on his chest. It slid slightly as the king's breathing struggled to continue. He was 25. No air, no strength, no clear mind, and still he ruled. Because to admit the end would be to admit the beginning had been flawed. Because the empire had been built not just on land and wealth, but on the illusion that its blood was chosen, sanctified, unbreakable. And now, that illusion had a name. Charles, the last Habsburg of Spain, a king in form, a child in truth, and a curse in flesh. Charles II died on the 1st of November, 1700. The day was quiet. The bells of Madrid rang slowly. No soldiers marched. No cities burned. The empire did not fall in flames or rebellion. It fell in silence. At his bedside, the air hung heavy with incense. His body, worn thin by decades of decay, no longer fought. His eyes stayed open longer than they should have. His lips moved, but no sound came. At the final breath, there was no drama, no thunder, just the settling of a body that had never fully belonged to itself. There was no air. The line had ended, and with it, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Dynasty crumbled, not with a sword, not with poison, but with the quiet exhale of a man who had never truly lived. Foreign powers descended quickly. France claimed rights through the Bourbon line. Austria protested. War broke out not over ideology or betrayal, but over inheritance. Over who had the right to claim the remains of an empire that had already decayed from the inside. Historians would later call it inevitable, but inside the walls of El Escorial, the truth was more intimate, more haunting. The priests recorded his death in a register lined with gold. The physicians left their final notes, more candid than ever before. They listed his afflictions one by one: mandibular deformity, severe digestive insufficiency, hypogonadism, epilepsy, cognitive delay, skeletal weakness, and at the bottom of the list, a phrase in quiet Latin: consanguinitatis ultimum donum, the final gift of inbreeding. Geneticists centuries later would study his lineage. They found the coefficient of inbreeding in Charles higher than that between siblings. His genome was so narrowed that it reflected a level of biological collapse unprecedented in any European royale. They found that his mother was also his cousin, that his father was uncle to his wife, that the branches of the Habsburg tree were not branches at all, but loops, endlessly folding into themselves, trapping weakness like a breath never exhaled. The numbers told a story the courtiers had long tried to bury. While the average coefficient of inbreeding in a population hovers near 0, Charles carried one exceeding 0.2. It meant that over 200 years of planned marriages had rendered his genetic code a closed circuit. No fresh blood had entered, only the repetition of old blood, twisted and compounded, until nature itself recoiled. The end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain was not marked by invasion or insurrection. It was marked by biological surrender. The empire had not been conquered, it had withered. Outside the palaces, the people mourned a king they had never truly known. They lit candles, they prayed for his soul, they knelt in cathedrals draped in black. But beneath the mourning lay confusion. The man they buried had ruled in name only. The court had governed in his place. Ministers had manipulated decrees. The real king had been weakness itself. The nobility shifted quickly. Alliances were redrawn, new banners raised. The name Habsburg was still spoken with reverence, but now with caution. The marriage policies once praised as strategic genius were now whispered as cautionary tales. In Austria, the imperial line continued for a time, but not without consequence. The jaw remained. The illnesses persisted. The portraits grew more rigid. And still, the family clung to the illusion of chosen blood, even as it betrayed them in each generation. The fall of Charles II was not just the fall of a man. It was the revelation of a truth too long ignored. That power does not excuse biology. The crowns cannot command chromosomes. That the human body, no matter how royal, will always remember what it is forced to forget. And so, the Spanish Empire passed not into the hands of rivals, but into the past. A chapter closed not with a roar, but with a wheeze, and a mouth that never closed. They buried him in the crypt beneath El Escorial, among kings whose names had reshaped continents. The marble slab bore no sign of the agony he endured, just his name, his title, and the dates between which he had breathed. But deep below the inscription, beneath the stone and the prayers, rested bones that told another story. The skull of Charles II remains. Scholars have seen it, measured it, photographed it. The lower jaw juts forward, unnaturally pronounced. The dental arch does not close. The zygomatic bones are fragile, the palate narrow. The remains do not whisper of royalty. They scream of repetition. In a museum vault, hidden from public view, are drawings made by early anatomists. They show the curvature of the spine, the shallow chest cavity, the malformed hips. The body was not made to carry a throne. It was made to collapse. And yet it ruled. Today, when historians speak of the Habsburg jaw, they often do so with detached curiosity. They treat it as a footnote, an oddity of art, a familial quirk captured in oil and canvas. But the truth is far heavier. It is the weight of silence layered over centuries, the refusal to confront the cost of purity, because the Habsburgs did not vanish. Their blood still exists in modern lineages. Their architecture still towers over capitals. Their portraits still hang in gilded halls. But if you look closely, behind the velvet robes and military honors, you will see it. A slight misalignment, a gaze too vacant, a chin just a little too long. History may close its eyes, but bone does not lie. And so, the final inheritance of the Spanish Habsburgs was not land, nor treasure, nor treaties signed in candlelit chambers. It was a caution carved into the flesh, a message sealed not in ink, but in marrow. You can trace it in the skulls preserved in royal tombs. You can see it in the portraits. If you dare to look past the gold and lace, you can feel it in the silence that followed Charles's last breath. The throne did not crumble with an army. It rotted from within. And yet, no monument speaks of this. No plaque in Madrid reads, "This was the king whose body bore the consequence of centuries." No cathedral whispers of the boy crowned by blood, not by choice, but he is there, waiting in the quiet, beneath stone, with a mouth that never closed. Not from astonishment, but because it could not. Perhaps that is why no one dares to lift the lid again. Perhaps the most terrifying legacy is the one that lives in secrecy. Because history prefers triumph. It prefers crowns placed, not ones too heavy to lift. But this story does not bow to preference. It stands, lopsided and breathless, a reminder that empires can be defeated not by swords, but by chromosomes. If history has gone silent from shame, then let the throne speak. Share this story. Speak the name no one dares remember, like this truth. Subscribe to the silence that still echoes under the marble. And do not look away, because what brought down the greatest dynasty of Europe was not a war. It was a jaw, still open, still watching, and still waiting to be heard.